Hey, Deserving listeners. I recently responded in an episode to an email in which someone wanted to date their therapist. She said that she had a large romantic and sexual attraction to her therapist, and she wanted to date her therapist. And she had heard my other talks on the podcast about this, warning against that, and also talking to clinicians out there about how to handle situations in which the client is attracted to you, and how to have boundaries and how to act ethically, and how to predict problems that usually happen when therapists and clients break those boundaries. And although I've had many episodes about this topic, I find that a lot of the listeners, or a subset of the listeners, whenever I talk about it, I get a lot of emails. And so, and this one was no exception, or maybe it was the greatest amount of emails I received after talking about it. I received a lot of emails from people writing in saying that they had experienced blurred boundaries with their therapist to varying results. Some people were talking about how they were harmed by the massive blurry boundary issues with their therapist. And some people said that it wasn't a problem. And so I thought in this episode, I would read all of those emails that I received the past couple of days and talk about them, analyze them, and comment on them as a way for both therapists and clients to understand the landscape of boundaries. Because whenever we talk about boundaries, meaning, should you date your therapist, or should your therapist tell you about their divorce that they're going through? Or what if the therapist talks about their own children? Or what if the therapist meets you at a restaurant instead of their, therapy office? Or what about a therapist that allows the sessions to go longer than normal? Or what about a therapist that texts with you on the weekends? And that's not, described in the treatment plan. These are all the blurry boundaries and boundary violations, boundary crossings that we talk about a lot. And I think that there are three different positions that I hear. One position is people will say, like, it's always unethical to blur your boundaries, which is actually not true. The other group of people will say is they won't say anything, but they'll act as if boundaries don't matter and that they can break any boundaries they want. And some of the people emailing in that I'll talk about were like that. Some of the therapists obviously had no knowledge, or at least no acknowledgement of the need to have boundaries. And then there's this third position that is the one that I admire and adhere to, which is that boundaries and the broader context of ethical decision making, it's nuanced and it's complicated, and it doesn't mean that we have complete flexibility. That's not the point. The point is that it's important for us to understand the foundation upon which to make ethical decisions. It's not necessarily a set of rules. It's a set of understandings that guide your decisions that are generally considered to be the standard of practice. And so knowing that foundation, which is much more complicated, whenever you take an ethics class, or at least when I started out in the field, I always wanted to just be told what to do. I was just like, okay, masters of ethics, just as I'm trying to be a therapist here. I'm trying to follow the rules. I want to follow the rules. Just tell me what to do. And a lot of times, aside from some very, obvious things like never have sex with your client, there are things where it's unclear and it depends on the situation. And the only way you can, as a clinician, understand how to navigate those situations is, one, to understand the principles very well, which takes a long time. And two, is to hear case after case after case after case after case, because each case is different. And as you hear the case and then you hear experts talk about how they see the case, you start to internalize this general ethics wisdom that will help guide you in your life. And so to that effort, I thought I would read these cases and discuss them. So this first email is from an anonymous patron. She writes, and this is a long one, but I think it's a good email to read. She writes, I just finished listening to your most recent episode about dating a therapist and wanted to respond because I experienced a similar situation. I have always felt like such a freak because of it. It is one of my closest kept secrets. I have never been able to find any research on the topic. In my late teens, I had a therapist who was a psychiatric nurse. I adored her. She was only supposed to be managing my medications, but because I was willing to talk to her, she ended up being my therapist too, and saw me for an hour almost every day for 2 months. In my mind, she was the most perfect mother for me. I wanted to be part of her family. Circumstances led me to not being able to see her at her place of work, so she offered to see me pro bono in her office outside of the hospital. We texted throughout the day, every day, often about mundane things. I have since read a lot about trauma therapy and how it's supposed to work, and I don't think she had any training in it because she didn't follow that at all. Talking so much, I became really close with her and learned a lot about her life. She was going through a really messy divorce. She went through bankruptcy. Her daughter had Asperger's syndrome, and she was struggling a lot with becoming a single parent. She made a lot of comments about her daughter not loving her. I think that was really hard for her. Because of her bankruptcy, she lost the office space she was working out of, so we met instead at restaurants, libraries, and in her car. She met a man and quickly decided to move in with him when he bought a house. From then on, our sessions were at that house, but by that point, they didn't resemble therapy sessions at all. That is how I met her daughter. After living with her boyfriend for a couple of months, they broke up, and she moved out to a temporary subletting situation. She was still having a lot of financial trouble, and she found a better job on the other side of the country. We started having phone sessions, but then our relationship was a secret. She suggested that I live with her daughter because she needed a roommate to save money, and it would make her feel better about both of us if we lived together. I agreed and thought all my dreams were finally coming true because I always wanted to become her daughter. She started referring to me as one of her kids and introduced me to her new boyfriend. She suggested that he, her daughter, and I could support one another while living where we were and then split moving costs when we finally moved to meet her across the country in a few months. She wanted him to be like a parent figure to me, and he wanted her to be a parent figure to her daughter as well. After a while, I had a relationship with him. I think I probably started things, but I really didn't know how else to act with an adult man. I was so lonely. He felt like this tenuous connection to her, and I was worried that if he didn't like me, she would stop loving me. I told her what was going on via text, and at first it was just like my mom all over again, calling me a disgusting liar. I sent her screenshots through the texts he had sent me, and she broke up with him as a result. She said I ruined her life, and that if she had known what I was really like, that she would never have agreed to work with me. I felt so ashamed, like I was to blame for all of it. I have read a lot since about why people repeat the same patterns over and over. I ended up alone in the same psych hospital I had met her in, but on the adult ward this time, admitted for being suicidal and underweight. The stress of it all caused a relapse in my PTSD and anorexia. I recently started seeing a therapist who specializes in complex PTSD, and I told him a little about the story, just a bit to see how he reacted, and he seemed to take it well. It's so humiliating. I've never met or even read about someone else in a similar situation. It's always about people in a sexual relationship with a therapist, but I never hear people write about a parent-child relationship with a therapist. Have you ever read any research about this or know anyone else that this has happened to? End of email. So, wow, right? A lot of details there to dive into. The first thing I want to say is that I created a Facebook closed group for people who have been harmed by their therapist, because I get so many emails from people along these lines. I think it's a relatively rare event to be harmed by one's therapist, but I have for whatever reason, become a bit of a lightning rod for such things. And so I think, and partially I think because there's so little resources on the internet for it. And so anyway, I created this closed group and it's called Clients Harmed by Therapy. And so if you go to our Facebook page or you just search for that, you can ask to join. And then if you look like you're a legit person, then we'll approve for you to join. Anyway, so let's review the clinician's treatment decisions with this anonymous patron here. So you have a teen client in a hospital who is in a psychiatric ward. She didn't say, but I'm guessing for suicidal ideation related to her depression and her anorexia. I'm guessing she went through a lot of abuse. She didn't talk about that. She's on medications. And her psychiatric nurse, who is the one giving her medications, I'm guessing the psychiatric nurse doesn't normally treat people with psychotherapy. It's just a guess. Who knows? But at the very least, it was the impression to this client was that the psychiatric nurse wasn't intending on being that sort of role for her, but upon meeting her in her med management discussions, the psychiatric nurse was like, "Ooh, I really am connecting with this client. I feel like I can really help this client, and I'm gonna become this patient's therapist as well." They proceed to have 1-hour sessions almost every day for 2 months. So that's interesting. Almost every day for 2 months. Now, the client seems to believe that the therapist had no training in trauma therapy. She didn't go into detail on that, but it doesn't surprise me. I would guess half to most therapists are undertrained on trauma therapy, and they don't even know they're undertrained on trauma therapy. So, anyway, when the client could no longer come to the facility, she transitioned her client to her private practice and saw her in her private practice office pro bono. At this point, and because they weren't seeing each other every day in the hospital, I'm guessing, they started texting throughout the day. So that's many texts every day, even about mundane things. The therapist at this point starts to self-disclose a lot. For example, she talks about her messy divorce, her bankruptcy, that her daughter has autism spectrum. Her daughter wasn't loving her. She talked about her difficulties in detail with her client who's, 17, 18 years old. And her therapist also talked about her dating life at this point. The therapist loses her office, so the sessions are transitioned to restaurant's library and the therapist's car. Actually, just to clarify or discuss this little detail is, it's not unusual to see clients in unusual places. I used to do in-home therapy, and that was challenging in terms of, the thing is as a therapist, you have to provide ethical treatment, and which has to be confidential, which means that if you're going to meet people outside of your office, you have to try to control the environment a little bit. And you could potentially control a library if you rented one of those or reserved one of those little rooms. But honestly, your car might be the best option because it's going to be really hard for someone to eavesdrop on that. But people could see you. Restaurants, though, that's going to be hard to keep confidential. But anyway, then she started having sessions at her boyfriend's house, the therapist's boyfriend's house. And at this point, the client is saying that therapy didn't resemble therapy sessions at all, which I don't know exactly what that means. I'm guessing what that means is it was much more of like a mother-daughter hangout session as opposed to a therapy session. The therapist moved to another state, and so they started doing phone sessions. The therapist started referring to her own client as one of her own kids. The therapist introduced her client to her boyfriend and to her daughter and suggested that the three of them live together, which it appears that they did. The therapist exposed her to what seems to be some sort of sexual predator. I mean, the client, it was hard for me I didn't ask her for clarification, But it sounds like what happened is there was a sexual relationship between the client and the therapist's boyfriend while they were living together. And she can go into detail. The emailer, the listener, is blaming herself for all of this. She's like, I started it. It's my fault. And maybe that's true. I don't know. But you're young at this point. You're 18, 19 years old. I'm guessing there's quite a bit of an age gap. Your therapist should understand that you are a vulnerable person to certain kinds of relationships. And as you say, it wasn't like the relationship started out of some sort of nefarious motivation from you. It was a pattern of yours, probably derived from abuse that you went through, that your therapist should absolutely understand. And you were so anxious about retaining the relationship with this pseudo mother that you had some wires crossed in your head, and you're thinking, well, if I'm really, really nice and pleasing, and I turn off myself in relation to this boyfriend, then that'll secure my security and attachment with my mother figure. And then that led you to being open to doing things with him that you wouldn't have done otherwise, or and didn't want to do. So you seem to be blaming yourself a lot over what had happened there. I don't obviously know the details, but just based on the little details I do know, I suspect if I understood the full story, I would not blame you for what happened at all. At the very least, even if you were culpable, which I doubt, at the very least, your therapist should know what your vulnerabilities are, one, and two, your therapist chose some kind of scumbag, some kind of douchebag who had a relationship with a. So let me just put this in. If I was in his shoes, okay, I'm a guy, and I meet a woman. I start dating her, and she says, "I have this client of mine who I have sort of adopted casually or unofficially as my own child, but I'm really trying to help her and trying to help her recover because I really care about her. And I want her to move into your house with my own daughter." And then so I'm like, okay, I have this girlfriend who has this kind of like this stepdaughter who is 18 years old. I assume I'm old because but who knows? I'm at least, I don't know. Anyway, and then I'm going to look at essentially my stepdaughter as a romantic or a sexual target. I mean, that's a particular kind of person. And given the chaos of this woman's life, the therapist's life, I suspect that she's not the best chooser of mates. And again, a lot of speculation here. Anyway, so some sort of drama happens. The clinician at this point blames the client for, quote, ruining her life. And I'm assuming that the professional relationship was terminated, although one could argue the professional relationship terminated long, long ago. So that's a summary. Now let's review the consequences. So there are a lot of boundary crossings and violations that the clinician went to. But before we get into discussing that more in more detail, let's review the consequences to the boundary crossings and violations. The therapist potentially could lose their license over this and income. It could also be sued tremendously too. At this point, it's unclear if she was even operating as a clinician by a certain point. But anyway, absolutely, just based on the details you said, there is basis for a licensing review by the state that administers her license. And if she loses her license, then she can't practice and she can't earn a living, and she'll be even in more financial trouble. You could also sue her civilly and actually just take money from her, which I think you deserve. So that's one consequence of in a very ill-advised decision-making process, this therapist decided to cross out boundaries. Another consequence here is the client feels tremendous shame. this person, this anonymous patron writing in, hasn't told anyone has only told very few people. The client is the victim here, and the client feels like she can't tell anybody. And the client blames herself for this. So good job, clinician, for doing that to this innocent person. The client is traumatized by the treatment and by the clinician's boyfriend and by the boundary violations. So good job, clinician. You have successfully traumatized your own client in a number of ways. The client's trust in therapy in general is threatened at this point. I commend the client here for seeking another therapist. It would have been a understandable conclusion to say that, why would I go to therapy if this is how I'm going to be treated? The client's PTSD reemerged, so good job, clinician. And the client's anorexia reemerged, which is life-threatening, so good job, clinician. All right, so let's get into the discussion here. So many problems. I've already discussed some. But before I go into the problems, I want to be clear about something. A lot of these boundary crossings, so there's boundary crossings, which are more gray zone areas, like accepting a $5 gift card from a client. That's a boundary crossing. Or telling your client that your grandma died. That's a boundary crossing. But it's not a boundary violation. So you got boundary crossings, which are more gray zone, which could be unethical and could be a problem, but it's not clear. And then you have boundary violations that are more generally often a problem, meaning that they would harm the client and harm the treatment. So examples of boundary crossings or just gray zone areas, or even just flat out no problem areas, are the following. Having daily sessions. Now, some of you out there might be like, whoa, an hour of therapy every day with this client? That sounds like a massive boundary violation. It's not. One, she didn't go into detail in terms of her email, but it sounds like they were in a hospital. And so that's often standard practice, is daily check-ins with your therapist. It might not be every day, but if you wanted to, I mean, you're the psychiatric nurse, you're in the psych ward, and it just means you just you just have a session with your patient who's inpatient, and they're 24/7. So daily sessions isn't a problem. Plus, there are some forms of therapy where that's what you want to do. Like I said earlier, I used to do in-home family therapy. And with some of my clients, I would go there, several times a week, if not every day, if they were in crisis. So daily sessions, it's not a problem. We saw what the general lax attitude to boundaries that this clinician had. We saw where it led. But if we just look at the individual things, also pro bono, providing a free service to clients is also not a problem. In fact, it's considered ethical practice to do that. In fact, in my field, marriage and family therapy, it could be potentially considered unethical for you not to, once you're more, financially stable, to provide pro bono services. One of the problems in my field is that it's definitely, it's for the rich. Poor people have a much harder time accessing mental health care. If you're rich, you got therapists falling out of your pockets. If you're poor, it's hard. Now, I should say that even if you're rich, sometimes it's hard to find the right therapist. But anyway, another boundary crossing here is texting throughout the day. Some of you clinicians out there might be like, whoa, that's a boundary problem. And yeah, I don't do that. I don't text with my clients at all. Some of even my supervisees will text me sometimes, and I'll be like, I don't like to text. Don't text me. Email me or call me or something. I just don't. There's something about texting that's just annoying to me. I like texting with my wife and my friends, but I just don't like texting with clients and supervisees. So for me, I don't do that, but for some people they do. And some forms of therapy actually involve that. Like when you're doing DBT or when you're trying to help someone with their recovery from addiction, then sometimes the treatment plan actually calls for texting throughout the day. Now, the texting has to be considered, or the ethical reasons for it and how it's affecting treatment, how it's affecting client. It's not just like always okay, but it's, some of you might be going, well, it's a massive boundary problem, but it depends. Self-disclosure, the therapist was disclosing a lot to the client. And to tell your client that you're going through a messy divorce, to tell your client that your daughter doesn't love you and that you're really sad about that. These are not often the sorts of disclosures that therapists will tell their clients. So it's definitely out of the norm, but it's not a slam dunk violation because it just depends. It depends on the way the therapist said those things. It depends on, did the therapist have a purpose in telling? Because you could tell your client some pretty personal things and have a good clinical justification for that. Like, you could tell your client, you know what, right now I'm going through a messy divorce. So I know what it's like to have chaos in my life. And I know your life is very chaotic, and I know that you shame yourself and feel really bad about yourself, but I'm here to tell you, my life can be really chaotic, and sometimes I think half of it is my fault that my life is chaotic. And it's not like I did this on purpose, so I want you, client, to understand that it's normal for people to have messy lives, and I don't want you to beat yourself up over it. So you understand, in that self-disclosure, there's a reason why I'm self-disclosing that I'm going through a difficult time. It's because I'm trying to normalize it for the client. I'm trying to help the client feel less shame. And it can be a very, very effective way of helping to normalize and to reduce shame in clients to self-disclose. Because it's one thing to tell a client, like, wow, you're really beating yourself up about this. I don't think that's fair to you. That holds some power. But it's so much more powerful when you can provide your own example. So I don't know what the therapist was thinking as they were self-disclosing all this. Given the overall pattern, I suspect the therapist wasn't thinking at all about the treatment implications and was confusing her own client for her daughter. But even your daughter, right? Like, your daughter's 17, 18 years old. I don't even know if it's appropriate or helpful or developmentally handleable for an 18-year-old to hear stuff like that. So it depends, but definitely if we knew more details, it definitely sounds like a violation, but it's not a slam dunk violation like the other things I'm going to get into in a second. Also, having sessions in public places. For some of you, you might be like, whoa, massive violation. Having a session in a restaurant is completely not okay. And again, for me, I don't do that. I've never had, occasionally I would work for 10 years of my life, about a third of my clients were these in-home families. And sometimes clients would be like, I don't really want to meet in the house. How about we meet at Starbucks or something? And I'd be like, to me, it didn't really matter, right? Because I'm driving to their house and I'm driving to Starbucks, so what's the difference to me? But I would always push back on that because of confidentiality and because I couldn't guarantee that, therapy can get kind of messy sometimes, right? People can start to cry, they can start to yell, they can feel very vulnerable, and to be in a public space with randos walking around is not an ideal space for that, right? That's the best space for that is your own office. Another space for that would have been the client's home or their apartment. A Starbucks isn't so great. In the car, again, as I said earlier, a little bit easier to control. In a library, if you found a closed room that you could reserve, if you're just sitting behind the periodicals, then obviously that's not a good thing. So again, the sessions in public places to some might be a massive automatic violation, but it's unclear. We'd have to hear more details about that. And then the sessions at her boyfriend's house, that could sound like a massive violation as well, but also not necessarily. One could frame it as the clinician had changed residences, and she moved into her boyfriend's house, but her boyfriend's house was essentially her house at this point because she was moving in. And it's not an ethical violation to see people in your own house. The clinician probably considered that her house at that point, even though it was a very new residence for her. And I'm guessing, I hope that she had a confidential space in that house to see her clients in. I operate out of my home. I always have. I've operated out of my home for the past 20 years, and I've never had any kind of problem or complaint about that. And there's things I have to do to make sure that I can uphold ethics. But so those are the things that I want to say. I'm not going to say everything this clinician did was an automatic, obvious violation. They could be if we looked into more of the details, but it's not a slam dunk. But some of the things that are more obvious, which I'll get into here in a second. So as we get into the violations of the boundaries, I just want to point out again that we see a clear pattern of breaking boundaries. This wasn't just one or two boundary crossings. It was a series of potentially thousands of incidents of boundary crossings and potential violations. And we also see what the pattern led to. By the end of these boundaries being crossed and violated, we have a situation where her client is now living in her home with her brand new boyfriend, whom she doesn't know very well, and her daughter, and her client is now in a relationship with, some sort of sexual or romantic relationship with her boyfriend. The clinician's boyfriend is in a relationship sexually with her client. Therapy sessions are no longer really therapy sessions. She is now keeping this relationship a secret. The emailer didn't go into detail, but I suspect that the clinician didn't want anyone to know about her relationship with her patient because she knew that if anyone knew about this relationship, she'd be in trouble. We have a situation where the clinician starts to blame the patient for everything wrong in her life. We see what happened by the end, and that's why we talk about the slippery slope. That's why we say, don't accept the $5 gift card from your client, not because that's a problem necessarily in and of itself, but it's potentially the slippery slope that if you don't nip it in the bud, you'll end up in a very bad spot. You can accept the $5 gift card from your client if you want, but you got to make sure that this doesn't become a pattern that grows and grows and grows. The other thing I want to point out here is that unethical therapists tend to be unethical in dozens of ways, and we see that with her. I hear this all the time. Whenever I hear cases like this, I just hear crossing after crossing after violation after violation. It just seems, when you don't understand the basis of ethical decision making, and when you've lost your way, then you generally lose your way repeatedly. So that's another thing is that to watch out for. If you're allowing your treatment to cross boundaries, there might be something fundamentally wrong with you. What's fundamentally wrong with this clinician is that she doesn't understand ethics. Her life is going down the tubes. This is actually a very familiar story. It's a very familiar. This has been known for decades, that when therapists, when their life is going down the tubes, they are very vulnerable to breaking boundaries and acting unethically and harming their patients. It's just a classic story. So what we see here is we have a clinician who, just didn't understand what she was doing. Her life was going down the tubes, and she obviously wasn't consulting with anybody, because if she had consulted, surely someone would have said, whoa, 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 what are you doing? So the other thing we want to look at here is countertransference. Hard to know because it's just an account from what, but I haven't talked to the clinician, obviously, but it sounds like the therapist had a massive amount of countertransference about wanting to have the daughter, the ideal daughter. And because this client was so loyal to her, because, the client came from abuse, the client came from mistreatment. So the client meets this woman that is like this caring, loving, secure, seemingly safe person. And the client pours all of her energy into the nurse practitioner. The nurse practitioner, the clinician, is like, whoa, I'm getting all my needs met because I feel so useful. And I can save this person. And so these are, good impulses. I want to help my client. I want to help this person. This person's been through a lot. I want to help them. This is what we call positive countertransference. The therapist has a lot of positive feelings. They feel very bonded to the patient. They feel very protective. They want to save this person. And the thing here is that without a way of understanding that, without a way of consulting about that, without a way of understanding and then managing those feelings, those can cause problems too. And we see that they did. Just because you have positive feelings for a client doesn't mean that something isn't wrong. Now, you should have positive regard, but there's a difference between positive regard, which is from a loving, warm, empathetic, professional place. There's a difference between that and wanting your patient to be your daughter. Now, if we went to the clinician years ago and said, do you want your patient to be your daughter? She would probably say, no, that's silly. My patient is my patient. I'm just really trying to help her because I want her to, have a secure attachment. And she's such a sweet person. I want to get her life back on track. So the clinician wouldn't know consciously that she was heading down a road. That's why we have consultations. That's why I consult with people. That's why people consult with me. 2+ heads are always better than 1. In some ways, 1 head will inevitably fail. That's why it's incredibly important that all you clinicians out there have a routine around consulting. If you don't, it's guaranteed that you're going to make mistakes that you wouldn't have made otherwise. And things like this could happen. If this is an accurate account from the emailer, she should lose her license, in my opinion. I know her life is already going down the tubes, and by losing her license, that would be quite another blow, and she might even not be able to work for a living at that point. But she's a dangerous person to her clients, clearly. This person clearly, so many different whys in the road, and every single time she chose the wrong direction. There are so many points where she could have pulled the reins and been like, whoa, like, no, I want to have my patient move in to my house with my new boyfriend, but that's got to be crossing a line somewhere. There's so many different whys in the road. I want to text with my client because I want to help her feel, tethered to a secure base. But every day about mundane things, I don't know if that's the best thing for her in the long run. Every single time. This clinician, again, if this is an accurate account from this emailer, has just a fundamental something wrong with them. Often what I find, and people will, email me examples of this. Often what I find is that it's not just a clinician who was going through a rough time, because a lot of clinicians go through rough times. A lot of clinicians go through divorces. A lot of clinicians start dating when they're seeing their clients. I'd say, majority of therapists go through pretty big life events, but most therapists operate ethically, or at least way more ethically than this therapist did. So it's not just that her life was going down the tubes. What also had to be present in my estimation, my speculation, is that she had to have had something wrong with her personality, her own complicated PTSD, her own borderline personality spectrum, her own narcissism spectrum, her own insecure attachment. Something else was going on there. And when you combine life going down the tubes with a characterological disorder, then you have these kinds of things. Because when you have a personality disorder, you're so desperate for security and soothing that you're just trying to make it minute to minute. And sometimes when you're doing that as a clinician, you don't got time to think about ethics and long-term consequences. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but the clinician seems, from the details given to me, to be absolutely liable for what happened with her boyfriend and the patient. That, to me, again, it's hard to know because she didn't go into detail, but my God, I mean, just imagine if, like, my wife had a relationship with one of my clients because I encouraged the two of them to live together. And my patient was, half her age. I can't see any other way to put that other than that is 100% my fault. Like, everything I was completely outside the standard of care, and obviously I didn't vet this person well enough in my personal life to have contact with my patient, which they shouldn't have anyway. Anyway, it's just I don't know if there's criminal charges but there's definitely civil court remedies that could be sought. The other thing here is that there probably is no progress notes beyond a certain point in the treatment. Whenever we have contact with our patients, we have to document it. So presumably every time the therapist texted with the client, every time the therapist talked with the patient while they were living together, all of those incidents need to be documented. Not every word, but every contact. And I would presume that after a certain point, that clinician just stopped keeping notes. Because can you imagine, like one of the notes would be, to address the treatment plan of reducing depression, suicidality, and anorexia symptoms, I recommend the client move into my new boyfriend's house, whom I don't know that well. Like, that's just not a progress note that I can imagine her writing. So that's another thing, emailer, that you can look into if you decide to pursue this, is you can demand for your client file. You can just, at this point, even though she's blaming you for ruining her life, which is hysterical in my mind, you can just say, hey, I want my file. And there should be two files. There should be a file for the hospital, so that one will probably be intact and probably in order. But once she transitioned you to her own office, if I understand the professional situation correctly, she should have a file also. And so wouldn't it be interesting to read that file? Because I'm guessing, because like I said before, in my experience, when you have an unethical therapist, they tend to be unethical about a lot of things. And it's possible that your file is completely jumbled, at the very least doesn't include a lot of contact with you. So it's just another thing to look into if you want. I highly encourage that you consider taking action if you feel like you've been wronged. Then I highly encourage you to contact your state Department of Health and potentially even a civil lawyer. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. Everyone has to make their own choice about that. It's a pain in the ass to do a complaint. It's not like the review board is always great in response to patients. But I don't know. You deserve to take action. And this clinician shouldn't be out there, in my opinion, if your account is accurate. All right, so that is that email. I have, 3 or 4 or 5 more emails. But I want to reserve the rest of this episode for patrons of the podcast. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor and someone who obsesses on ethics sometimes. This episode is just for patrons, the rest of this episode, just for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to listen to the rest of this episode and all of our other premium episodes, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. Go to patreon.com, search for Psychology in Seattle, become a patron, and you'll get instructions on how to access all of our premium episodes. If you have trouble with the premium episodes, please email contact@psychologyinseattle.com, and I will personally help you with it. For those of you that don't know, the software developers of the world have failed to develop a usable system for people to access premium episodes. If I could pay $10,000 for an app that would work well, I would do it, but it just doesn't exist. It will exist soon. There are some promising products that I'm researching currently that might work, but we'll see. So I apologize for sometimes it being hard to access the premium episodes. It's particularly hard for those of you who have trouble with technology to begin with. A lot of you young people who are really good with technology, you have no problem with it. So, so we're doing what we can. Anyway, so yeah, become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. Do it now.